This unit guide is going to show how to counter the Zealot with units from all three races in Starcraft 2. I want to start with Protoss versus Protoss. And in the early game, you can use Stalkers to counter a lone Zealots, or just, Zealot rushes, what have you. And you do that by microing the Stalker. If you just try to attack the Zealot straight up, this doesn't work. You do have to micro. And I'm just moving, stopping to shoot a half a second, and then moving again. The Stalker's faster than the Zealot, so this works out. Okay, so that's how you use that. The Oracle works well too, and the reason I mention the Oracle here is because if you open up with a gateway or two in like a mothership core, put out early pressure, have some success, you can drop a Stargate and pump out Oracle. You'll never use this as part of your main army, but it does apply in Protoss vs. Protoss. And the reason it works so well is just because Oracles burn down Zealots and they're fast enough to chase them down. Okay, so those are the early encounters. Once we get later in the game, you will need to use a different unit. So for this, I like the Colossus. Is really the easiest way to counter the Zealot. And you can use the stop and shoot micro, but with charge, they're still going to get some hits off. Really, what you ideally want to do is just you want to have some support units that can tank for the Colossus. And the Colossus doesn't always work because once the enemy has Tempests, Tempests are very strong versus Colossi. So in that case, you might want to switch over to the Archon, which you'll see is very good versus Zealot, especially as numbers increase. Zealots are biological units, so they do take bonus damage from the Archon. The splash damage tends to hit lots of Zealots at once. It's really a lopsided battle. And you can micro away hurt Archons to protect them. So the last counter we're going to discuss is the Sentry. It's not actually a direct counter, but it can be used two ways. One, you can create a kind of a unit wall, like you might against Zerg, where you take your units and you kind of surround your units here in such a way that the Zealots can't get in. So that's something to consider. And Zealots and Immortal, or Sentries and Immortals normally are really poor versus Zealots. Okay, so the other one I wanted to talk about, we're going to actually change the terrain to a choke. And you'll find choke points where you can trap Zealots in like that, or you can just split the army in half. So that is another option for the Sentry to beat the Zealot. Let's get back to our big field. So that's it for Protoss counters. These are plenty of options for you. For Terran players, easiest option here is going to be the Hellbat every time. Doesn't matter if you're going for mech or bio. They're just really good. You do want to make sure you have Infernal Pre-Igniter. That does affect Hellions now. And even if you're bio, you can use upgradeless Hellbats against Zealots, and they'll get healed by your medevacs, and they do a ton of damage versus Zealots. So it does work out, quite well. So easy counter right there. Another counter to consider, especially in small skirmishes and earlier in the game, is the Hellion. And you just use the same kind of micro that you use against the Stalker. And these will actually can flawlessly beat Zealots. And even with charge, you can still kite decently. So that's the Hellion in action. Marines and Marauders alone don't do well versus Zealots, but if you kite well and you have the right upgrades, as in combat shield, stim, and concussive shells, even if the Protoss has charge, you can beat Zealots by using good scoot and shoot micro. And then when you get backed into a corner, you just load up. This map has weird, has strange AI. But yeah, you can pull out and do the same kind of thing. So you get the idea. It's not a strong counter, but it at least helps. Make sure you do scoot and shoot. Don't just rely on... don't just stand there and attack. And one way to make this battle go a lot smoother is to add in a ghost or two. And the reason is they can use EMP, but also ghosts do bonus damage. Or let me take that back. I thought we had the big army here. Okay.
Okay. Roger. Power down. Of course.
You'll see the ghosts actually do pretty good damage against Zealots. The reason is they do have bonus damage versus light. So I don't have the upgrades I need here, but you can see this went much smoother with the EMP ahead of time, plus the Ghost DPS. Now I'll just show you a Ghost versus a Zealot.
Yes, sir.
So the Ghost doesn't tank the Zealot's DPS very well, but if it's protected, it does quickly take out Zealots itself. And the last unit, I mean, it's not technically a counter per se, is going to be the Banshee. And the reason I'm going to discuss it is because it's the only really Terran air unit that's fast enough to chase down annoying Zealots. So if a Zealot's running, you can chase it down. And, you know, with other air units like the battlecruiser, with charge, Zealots can just run away from the battlecruisers and try to focus on SCVs or buildings or supply depots. They're just otherwise really annoying. So the Banshee is definitely better for that. I do want to show you the Thor real quick too. The problem with this is even if this Thor does okay, it's too expensive, I feel like, to use against the Zealot. I mean, it does pretty good, as you'll see. With charge, it's a little less effective, but the problem is the cost. The Thor costs 200 gas, Zealots don't. So this is really the even cost battle. It's 5 Zealots to 1 Thor. So if you're maxed out, Thors are good versus Zealots, but you know you might not go out of your way necessarily to use them because Zealots are just so cheap. So you got to consider cost when it comes to the Thor. So that's really it for the Terran. We're going to talk about Zerg next. Zerglings are an interesting case. When upgrades are equal, things are good to use the Zergling against Zealot, especially if you micro away the injured Zerglings. So now the problem is, if the Zealot gets +1 weapons, and you don't have armor, or it has +2 weapons and you have only 1 armor, you run into trouble, because now the Zealot 2-shots the Zergling. So upgrades are super important here. So Zerglings go from being a pretty good unit to use against Zealot to a pretty poor unit. Something to keep in mind. I'll take that upgrade away. So another good unit to use against the Zealot is going to be the Roach. And Roaches are nice and cheap. They got a lot of health. So they work well. And we're going to use Scoot and we are going to back away from these a little bit just to get some extra hits in. And doing this really reduces the Zealot's damage. And if you're on creep or if you have roach speed, you can really make this annoying because you can get much more distance and you can actually kite the Zealot. So you do have to kite that way. Another option is to be the Hydralisk. And the reason the Hydralisk works here is because the Hydralisks need to sit behind the roaches. The roaches will tank. and the Hydras will do damage. So the Hydralists just attack the Roaches straight up. It's not very, doesn't work out very well for the Zerg. So you really need the Roaches to tank in order for the strategy to work. So as you see, the Zealots really do a lot of damage to the Hydras once they get close. So Hydras alone do not do well versus Zealots. As the numbers increase, it favors the Roaches and Hydralisks more and more. One hard counter for the Zealot is going to be the Ultralisk, and this is particularly the case as unit numbers increase, and of course with Chitinous Plating. With Chitinous Plating, the Zerg Ultralisk has armor of 3, so it barely takes damage versus the Zealot. As you can see, this is a hard counter. It's not even a close fight, no micro required. Broodlords, naturally, just like they do against all ground units, they do well. Especially ground units that can't hit air. And the Broodlords will keep the Zealots entertained for a while so that you can, so that they don't run around quite so much. So that's obvious, an obvious sort of counter. The larger counter I want to discuss is the Swarm Host. And this one may not be quite so intuitive at first. And here's how it works. So let's say we have an even number of Zealots. Zealots have charge. And we'll give the Swarm Host Enduring Locusts. Okay, so a common strategy when using these Swarm Hosts is you're going to burrow them, send in your Locusts, and then while these are going in, you're going to run these Swarm Hosts back. And you can shift click to make them burrow. And that way, it gives them more distance so that by the time the Zealots actually get in range, the next round of Locusts is spawning. So you really need 2 waves in that manner to make the Swarm Hosts work well. The Locusts are strong against Zealots, and Zealots, I guess theoretically they could try to run by. Where they'll just try to ignore the Locusts, and I don't think that this works out very well, because they just take a lot of damage. And if you actually, uproot these Swarm Hosts, then you can actually get away, and the Locusts will chase down Zealots when they're on creep. So that's about it for the Zealot counters. I hope this video was helpful. Colossi and Archons are good for Protoss. Hellbats are great for Terran. And Ultralisks and Swarm Hosts, or even Roaches and Hydralisks, all those units are very strong versus the Zealot. And that's it for this video, and I hope it helped you.